Welcome back to Epic Literature. We move past the Roman world now to explore the language, literature, and culture of the Anglo-Saxons in the great British epic Beowulf. After the Romans evacuated Britain in 405-406 AD, they left not only a power vacuum, which caused neighboring peoples to perpetually invade Britain over the course of 6 centuries, but a cultural void that created what has been inaccurately but descriptively titled the Dark Ages. We do not know who authored Beowulf because it appears to be the product of several centuries of oral tradition. But we do know it was finally transcribed by English monks. In fact, because monks wrote the story down, we can even see their hands at work in infusing the text, which is a Germanic war story, with Christian elements. Keep in mind also that the values espoused in this text are not exactly Christian in a strict sense. The Anglo-Saxons were a violent people living in a violent, untamed, and uncivilized corner of Europe. Thus, they prized virtues like loyalty between the thane and his ring-giver. Women were viewed as keepers of the peace and keepers of culture. And boasting is considered a natural part of maintaining the integrity of good war stories. So there will be inevitable moments of conflict between heroism and Christian morality. Conflicts which the monkish writers may or may not have been cognizant of as they recorded the story, although it is very likely that they were aware of these inconsistencies. For instance, Grendel is identified as the ancestor of the biblical Cain, as are all monsters, goblins, and chimeras. This inclusion certainly would not have been in the original oral tradition, but was added to layer a Judeo-Christian interpretation on to the secular text. So pay particular attention as to how Christian faith is incorporated into this warrior ethos. As another example, or extension of this concept, we see the role of fate changing from its function in classical antiquity. If you recall the battle between Hector and Achilles at the end of the Iliad, the gods were debating or warring while the two mortals battled around them. Even though he is king of Olympus, Zeus cannot decide the outcome of the battle, and he holds out the scales for the fates to decide. This is instructive because it shows us that in the ancient world, even the gods could not overrule destiny, and they themselves were ruled by fate. And fate, what the Anglo-Saxons called weird in Old English, which is the etymology for our modern English word weird, which just means strange, fate was always out to destroy you. But before Beowulf fights Grendel, he adopts a very providentialist view of fate. First of all, fate is controlled by the Christian God. And secondly, he is working fate not to our destruction, but to our betterment. Thus, Beowulf is confident that he will be successful in battle. And if he is not, well, then that's okay too, because God is providentially in control of all things, including his soul. Beowulf himself is a great hero from Geatland on the Scandinavian peninsula. He comes to Daneland to relieve King Hrothgar from an invading monster named Grendel. Beowulf does this not only because he is just that awesome as a warrior, but because Beowulf's father owes Hrothgar a great debt. Hrothgar had settled a blood feud that Beowulf's father had started much earlier on. Now this concept of blood feuding will run throughout the text, showing us how much of a threat this was to the Anglo-Saxon way of life. The Grendel episode is only the first of 3 episodes, where Beowulf must use strength and cunning to defeat the evil attacking the community from without. Yet at the same time, there are also evidences that the text is concerned with the evil within. The hostility of Unferth, the thief who breaks into the dragon's hoard, and even perhaps within Beowulf himself are all loose threads that, when unraveled, tear away at the fabric of peace and Anglo-Saxon values. So important questions to ask of the text include the following. Where can we identify instances, number 1, of an interlaced structure developing between Christian theology and the pagan warrior ethos? This is probably one of the questions I spend the most amount of time with my students. How do we see these values intersecting and sometimes at radical conflict with each other? Number 2, what is the role of fate in the text? How does it differ from classical epic? And how might the monkish hand be doing something a little bit more instructive and expanding upon the Anglo-Saxon conception of fate? Number 3, how do the individual digressions, like, for instance, Finn and the Frisians, or the story of Queen Modrith? How do they add meaning to contemporaneous events in the story? How are they examples or illustrations of how we are to further understand what's happening in the narrative as a whole? Number 4, from a Christian perspective, how does the narrator view the moral situation in 5th century Britain? What does the text seem to be saying about violence, about boasting, about pride? Number 5, is Beowulf considered an example of a great hero? If so, does this mean he is automatically a wise ruler? Are those concepts complementary, or are they mutually exclusive in the text? And finally, what is the eschatology, or the sort of view of the end and end times of the Anglo-Saxons? Note, this isn't just found at the end of the story, but it's a fear that permeates the entire text from the very beginning of the narrative. How does their fear and resignation about the end of all things, how does it inhibit any hope in this violent world? Godspeed your reading.